Well, today we have the privilege of visiting with Matt White, and he is a college professor and he is an author. He wrote a fabulous book, Prairie Time, and I curled up during our bad weather one Sunday in front of the fire and read it, and it was a wonderful, wonderful read. I learned so much. I love how you wove together history and ornithology and
And now I get calls from my mom with prairie updates all the time.
just, it's a wonderful book. So thank you so much for joining us, Matt.
Well, thank you for the nice words. It's a pleasure to speak with both of you and to meet your daughter. And I'm looking forward to it. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, so let's start off with, how did you get involved with the prairie? How did your passion get going? And, just some of your background.
Well, that's a good question. And I guess any kid who roams the woods and the pastures, as I did, you ask yourself, what was here first? What came before all this? And maybe you wonder about the Native Americans, in this case, the Caddo. And you wonder, what did it look like? The buffalo. And those were questions I had. I didn't know that that was even knowable. And in high school, I guess that would be the best place to answer this. We had to do a wildflower collection.
Mm.
7th grade, we had to learn the Latin names of, I believe it was 20 or 30 species. We had to press them, and we started in spring. It was probably around spring break. We had to go out, and he would take us out. Our biology teacher was named Mr. Gary Crow. He's still living. He would take us out, and we would collect these wildflowers, and we would press them in books. And when they were dry, then we would glue them onto the index cards, and we had the names. And, well, he would look the names up in his Schinner and Mahler Spring Floor of North Central Texas, which was self-published or published by SMU Press. It was a green book. I later found one at a used bookstore, and I have it just for sentimental purposes. And we had to learn the Latin names of these flowers. And it got me thinking. And later, when the Schinner and Mahler's book was updated in 1999 by the people over at BRIT, the Botanical Research Institute of Texas, it really piqued my interest. Now I can know these flowers. I can know more of what they are. And I began wondering, where are you going to find the most flowers? Where are you going to find the most prairie? I guess the idea of a prairie being something that was not plowed up. The Nature Conservancy had a couple of prairies, and I decided to go look at them. And it took some courage to do it, because finally I drove over to one. I think it was the Paul Matthews Meadow. I think was the first one, which is west of Greenville in Hunt County. And I was just blown away by all the flowers out there. And I started talking to a couple of people. I worked with a guy named David Montgomery. I don't think he's living anymore. And he worked at Paris Junior College and in Paris. And he was sort of a prairie guy himself. And so I started picking his brain. And I started realizing, what if I could find my own? The literature said there were only like 5,000 acres left or something. And I thought, I bet that's not right. I bet there are more out there. And I started driving around and I started finding them. And then I'm like, I need to write a book. And I didn't know what I was going to write. I thought I was going to write some kind of encyclopedia. But books just take on a life of their own when you start writing them. It's like I don't know, it's just like magic. I don't know how to explain it. It just happens. And people would show up and call me and say, you need to know me. I have a prairie. And I guess word got out. This was before the internet. I didn't even have, I probably did have email, but nobody had smartphones back in the late 90s. It was just this organic thing. And my editor I had done a book on birds already for Texas A&M University Press. And Shannon Davies, just retired, wonderful lady. I said, I want to write a book about prairies. And she said, please do. And I would call her and say, you don't believe what happened. And she said, well, you were meant to write this book. You were meant to write this book. I probably bugged the heck out of her, because every time I'd find another one, I would be like, you can't believe what happened. You can't believe what happened. And she would be well, this was a sign. You were supposed to write this book. And she was so gracious. And actually, if you want to know more about her, she's a good person to talk to as well. She just retired from A&M. She had been at UT, the editor there, and she rose all the way up to be their press editor. But yeah, wonderful relationship and encouragement. And that's really how the book came to be. When I started, I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I had an idea that I wanted to make people aware. I can remember sitting on my bed thinking, how do I say this? If you have an advocacy for something, a lot of people advocate for things, feed the children or some advocacy group. And I thought if people were more aware of how endangered these prairies were, that more people would care about them. That was really what motivated me to write the book, was to bring this to people's attention, that we have these little bitty fragments of this ancient landscape in our midst. And we've lost so many just since I wrote Prairie Time. But that's another story.
I think
that's how it came to be.
I think you were meant to write this book, and just listening to you and your story, it sounds like it is magical, which is amazing. And that segues pretty perfectly into my main question. And honestly, if listeners just take away this message, I think it would be a great success, which is, why should people care so much about prairies? What makes them unique, and what makes them so vital to our ecosystems? And I just feel like many people don't really think about prairies too often. We think about mountains and forests and oceans, but prairies kind of seem to be left behind. So from the prairie guy's perspective, what can you tell listeners in terms of, this is why they're so important and this is why we should conserve them and save them?
Well, I'm going to answer that in a little odd way, maybe an unusual way. Good question. It is the question. Why I care? Biodiversity, of course, that's the number one answer that people would give you. I'm going to go back a little further, though, and give a little more unconventional answer, and we can come back to the more conventional one in a minute. Walt Whitman, Leaves of Grass. This is kind of a weird thought, but he said, America was a grassland country. It was a prairie nation. They say that you could, a squirrel could go from the Atlantic coast to the Great Plains, and then when it got to the Great Plains, it got to the prairies, it would stop. Well, that's not actually true. There were prairies all throughout the East. New York, there were prairie chickens up there, even on Long Island. All the way to the coast, there were coastal prairies. Even among the forests, the mountains, there were prairies, there were grasses, even in deep East Texas. So there were grasses everywhere. In the 1800s, people knew this. America was a grassland nation. And the prairie, a word we borrowed from the French, was the place where, we had never plowed. The plows had never been there. Maybe the buffalo had grazed it. Walt Whitman understood what that meant. And let me see if I can explain it. Great Britain was a nation of forests, and they cut their forests down and became a seafaring nation. They became a very mighty nation with ships. It took 60 or 80 acres to make one ship. It's amazing when you think about it. It took 2,000 oak trees and 1,000 other trees to make a ship of the line at the time of the American Revolution. Britain spent their trees to become a world power. And on the eve of the Civil War, Walt Whitman in Leaves of Grass, which some people see it as sexual or lewd, it's really not, although there is some in there. But he says that the grass is the symbol of equality because it grows for the slave or the poor man as well as the rich man, the slave as well as the free. And I'm paraphrasing that. Didn't really know I was going to go there, but I think we should care about prairies because they became a symbol. Even Walt Whitman said they were a symbol of equality.
Interesting.
I love that.
I've never
They are
thought of it.
historical. Yeah, and I'm gonna write that up somewhere. I'm gonna write that up. I'm working on that, putting that in something. So maybe, maybe I shouldn't divulge too much of that right now. But in the political climate that we are in right now, if we are blinded to our natural history, then we are blinded to ourselves. We don't see, we don't even see what makes America. Now, Walter Prescott Webb, who is the Great Plains historian, said that the frontier, and Americans had a different idea of what frontier was. Frontier in Europe was the boundary between two countries. So the Rio Grande would be the frontier between Texas and Mexico. We don't say that in America. Frontier is an empty spot we migrate to, we take. The prairies, unfortunately, we lost some real good prairies in 2020. We lost the Pioneer Prairie in Mesquite. Been on the radar of conservationists for half a century, and in the end, warehouses beat it out.
Ooh.
Oh.
It was the only little 100-acre swath left to go to in Mesquite. Part of the American ethos is we have unused land. And anytime there's unused land, we have this. It started at Jamestown. We're going to take more. We're going to go. We're going to go. We're going to go. And so that's why it's very difficult. It's almost un-American in some people's view to save a piece of property because it's really there for development. What I'm arguing is these prairies preserve the original country. They're older than any of us. They preserve the geology. They preserve the biology. They preserve the bugs. They preserve the botany, the butterflies, the real diversity that's there. Now, many of the pieces are missing. The fire is missing. The buffalo are gone, and so there are people trying to bring that back. But I think we're poor for having lost big chunks of the prairie. If I can add one more thought to that question,
Please.
Walt Whitman in Leaves of Grass, they understood what the grass was. Lincoln came along and said, and this is neither good nor bad. I'm not trying to be preach a sermon here, but Abraham Lincoln put a welcome mat to the world in front of the prairie in North America, and he said, with the Homestead Act, as long as you have applied for citizenship, you are entitled to 160 acres of land if you have not waged war against the United States. That was the end of the prairies, the beginning of the end, not in Texas, but on the Great Plains. The railroad was the beginning of the end in Texas. So Lincoln, with the Homestead Act in May of 1862, opened up with the stroke of his pen, opened up a welcome, imagine not a wall, but a welcome mat to the world, saying, we stand for equality. And we spent our prairie on an idea that if you were not a slaveholder, if you were willing to work hard and be free, that you could get ahead in life. So the prairie is the American dream.
Wow.
And it was the breadbasket of our nation,
right?
Too.
If you go to the store and you buy, wheat or bread or corn or whatever, we need the prairie because it fed us. We still need the rich topsoil. Story on KER today about how and people who've looked at prairies know this, the topsoil's gone.
Yeah.
The rich prairie earth is gone. And so now we're using synthetic fertilizers, chemicals, petroleum. We are what we eat, right?
Yes, most definitely.
So that's a weird way to answer the question, but why do we preserve prairies? That's why I think we should, because we're preserving a piece of that American equality.
I love that. And it was way better than just a biodiversity answer. So thank you for that. It was history and equality and all this awesomeness roped into one answer. I can tell you're a professor.
And
Well, that's a bad word in some places.
No, it's
Not
a great,
around
it's a
us.
great word for me.
yes, same here. So,
Okay, good. Thank you.
so you were talking about when you first got interested in prairies, you decided to get in the car and start looking for them. What if someone wanted to look for virgin prairies? How will they know that they're looking at a virgin prairie or a remnant of the original
The-
prairie?
well, there are indicator species, um, plants that grow there, the grasses, the wildflowers. Most pastures have been robbed of their floral diversity or their grasses. There's a signature. Once you see one, no two are alike. I've seen a bunch. I'm not claiming to have seen them all of them because I haven't, but I've never seen two that are exactly alike. But there's something that they all share, and that is a footprint, an ecological footprint. That means the plants are there, and it's certain plants. May not be the same ones on every place, but there are certain plants that go away as soon as the place is plowed up.
Interesting.
And
So,
in terms of what people can do, when we're talking about reforesting, for example, everyone can feel like they're contributing by planting a tree. Or if we're talking about establishing pollinator friendly areas, and you can plant natives. But one thing when I was thinking about prairies, it seems a bit daunting, this idea of restoring, because they do inherently need large spaces of land. And so what would you say to the average person like me living in Dallas and I have a yard? Is there anything I can do other than supporting organizations that are restoring those larger areas of prairie? But is there anything I can do in my own home to help with prairie restoration?
absolutely. Absolutely. And you said it. You can support organizations. You can go on field trips. You can try to convert people. Those are all wonderful. Get educated, read books. You can also plant little prairies. And this is something I'm really kind of keen to start doing at some point. And that is building little 6x6. That would be 36 square feet. Imagine if you had a little 36 square foot prairie in lockdown.
Mm-hmm.
In a corner of a sidewalk, 6 foot by 6 foot, or 4x4, that mirrored the prairie, and you could watch it. It would be an almost spiritual existence, and I chose that word on purpose. It would be an almost spiritual existence to see that every day. I put prairie plants in my garden. I'm pointing to imaginary windows where things are planted, which I built a prairie in my backyard. I'm going to say 70 by 40. It's an ellipse, a long ellipse, kind of a football shape thing. And it's about 15 years old now, and I do nothing to it.
Wow.
I burn it occasionally. And it should probably be burned soon. It's been 2 or 3 years since I burned it, and it could be burned easily right now. But it doesn't have weeds in it. It doesn't. I mean, I've got Bermuda grass around it, and it doesn't go in it. Bermuda grass goes in anything.
Oh,
It
yeah.
doesn't go in this.
Why?
It doesn't. It's too thick. Can't live in there.
Wow.
It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. It's really cool. But it's the only thing I've ever seen that'll tell Bermuda grass to sit down and shut up. Even
I've never seen anything, and that's coming from a landscaper here.
yeah, it really does. It's unbelievable. And I didn't get it all out when I put it in because I couldn't. It literally pushed it out. It's too dark, and the thatch that builds up. I'm using my hands here. It builds up this thatch that really excludes the Bermuda grass. And then when you burn it, which it's been a couple of years since I burned it, I wait till the tall grasses are dry and the grass is what it would do, and just burns. And I don't even worry about it. I'm in the country, so I don't have to worry about burn bans or anything. But I wait till it's not windy to do it. So.
Well, can you're
That's what you could do, though. Yes.
well, you've talked, you've mentioned the buffalo and fire, but can you talk about the five elements of the prairie other than the buffalo and the fire?
Other than those, well, the in North Texas, and we're talking Dallas, or the Blackland Prairie extended originally from, say, San Antonio. I call it a tornado through Texas. From Texas, I mean, from San Antonio all the way up to the Red River, and it got wide at the Red River. It went down to a point at the very bottom, and that was true tallgrass prairie. As you went out into the hill country or further west, the grasses got shorter. That was all prairie too. But the tallgrass prairies need water,
Okay.
lots of water, and it's correlated roughly. And this is really rough. 30 to 32 inches to 34 inches of rainfall annually. So water, fire, buffalo, those are the
and the soil.
big ones. Well, obviously the soil, but see, that's a good question, because the prairie begins to make its own soil.
Yeah.
And that's a real question. Which comes first, the chicken or the egg?
Mhm.
Because the prairie soil builds up. And let me tell you a story. I have a little concrete cement driveway area. And about 20 years ago, I decided it was an old terrace from when this was farmland. It was a hump like that, maybe 6 feet, 5 feet wide. And I decided I wanted to put that in prairie grasses adjacent to the driveway. And it's kind of a long linear area. And I put these grasses in. And last fall, before Christmas, I went out and looked at that. And this was absolutely incredible. The grass roots had extended out onto the driveway a foot, and there was 4 inches of soil under those grass roots. They had built soil on top of the concrete 4 inches in 20 years. And it was the most loose, rich, organic. It was the best designer soil I've ever seen.
Wow.
So the solution to our lack of topsoil is we got to start planting prairie grasses. Let the hay, let the thatch decompose, and build the prairie up, build the soil back that way. It's not dead tree mulch. It's too acid. It's prairie grass.
Mm. Well, if 4
So,
inches of rich topsoil on top of concrete isn't showing you that they're doing work, I don't know what is. And actually, that leads me
it's
to well, as you were talking, I've been doing a lot of research and learning a lot about regenerative farming, and I think that's a big topic of conversation right now. Have you done any research or know much about the prairie's role in sequestering carbon? And because I think a lot of people go straight to planting trees as the method to help reduce CO2 in the atmosphere, but from the image you just described of the plants creating soil and having all this, the rich biodiversity, it seems like prairies could also do a really great job at sequestering carbon. Have you done any research on that?
Well, I think they do. I have not done any research on that. Remember, I'm more of a writer and a grower and an observer. I'm really not qualified. There is research about that, though. And I think it's essential that we preserve grasslands, open spaces, restore grasslands. You're right. We do tend to think of trees as sequestering carbon, but for a while, I've been convinced that prairies do the same thing.
Well,
the roots of the prairie grasses go ahead.
No, you please finish. You finish.
The roots of the prairie grasses. Have you ever heard the term grassroots?
Yes.
A grassroots movement?
Mm-hmm.
was because the prairie grass roots go down sometimes 20 feet. They're firmly embedded, and they do things that, you know, I think are really miraculous almost. They create the prairie grasses actually create the soil that the prairie grasses need.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Oops, I think we lost you for a second.
I think you froze.
Are you there? Can you see us? Okay, perfect. Can you hear
Yeah.
us? Okay.
Yeah, it said something's unstable there for a minute. So
Well, you ended on a great note. It's the grass is creating the soil that they need. So
okay, good. Ask me another question.
perfect. We're back on.
Well,
Yeah.
one of the comments that I loved in your book, you wrote that you like to think of going in. Hold on. You like to think of yourself as going into the prairie instead of on the prairie. You know, like everyone thinks of on the prairie because Little House on the Prairie, but you talk about going into it. What's the difference for you, and what's that feeling that?
Well, you walk on the floor, but you go into a house.
Mm.
That's true.
And the forest has a floor, but it also has a ceiling and walls. But because we be rather taller than most plants, we don't think of it that way. We sort of tower over them. But on many prairies, the grasses were actually taller than us. So you can literally go into one without getting on your hands and knees.
Mm.
It's really an experience when you get to do that. There were tales of grassland prairies that a person had to get on horseback to see over.
Wow.
My gosh, I've never seen that. And we visited the Climber Prairie about 2 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
and I have probably gone to a couple of others, but I've never seen the grasses that tall.
It is something to see, and it's actually disorienting a little bit because it's like going into a cornfield. You can visualize that. It would be easy to get turned around or lost.
And I love that perspective change. And when you equated it to you walk on a floor, you go into a house. And again, I go back to it seems like inherently we give more value to a forest because we say you go into a forest, but you just walk on a prairie. And I think making that distinction of perspective is really important as part of our goal to have people care about the conservation of prairies. We need to think of it as their own ecosystem that you're actually becoming a part of when you experience it. You're not just walking on a prairie the way you would just walk on a lawn of Bermuda grass. It's not the same.
Exactly right.
I love that. I love that.
That's,
Well, my mom picked a little quote from your book that she loved. And before we start winding down, I'd love for you to touch on this. On page 180, it says, I will find a way to convince people that our natural heritage is a precious part of who we are and an important legacy we leave to our children. And that's something that you've mentioned already here and there in our conversation. And I think it's such an important point to make. And I want to follow up with the question, which we've touched on a little bit, but are there any specific people other than yourself, but people or organizations around the country that are trying to preserve the prairie, or where can our listeners go and find these organizations that are doing work to help support restoring those ecosystems?
I'll confine my answer mainly to Texas.
Okay.
There are nationwide organizations. The first one I would say is the Native Prairie Association of Texas, NPAT. They have a website which can be found easily. There's some wonderful volunteers, people working in there. There may be a couple of paid people. There are a couple of one or two people who may be getting some, assistance, but it's mainly volunteer people. The Nature Conservancy historically has been interested in prairies, and they still have some people who are interested in helping preserve prairies. There are other national organizations, not as familiar with them. There are some wonderful people in prairie conservation, though, I can tell you that. People that really believe that prairies need to be preserved, believe that the biodiversity needs to be preserved. That's why I guess I take a more historical approach, is because I want to show that, I want to sort of separate my argument and say, and it's really just dawned on me since I wrote Prairie Time about how valuable they are to us as Americans, and even to us as Texans. I do a blog called More Prairie Time, and to be honest, after COVID hit, I have not been as diligent in doing that. moreprairietime.org. The book is titled Prairie Time, and that came from my oldest daughter, Natalie, who we were going to not Clymer Meadow, but Paul Matthews Meadow. We were going to Paul Matthews Meadow one evening, and she said, "Dad, I need more Prairie Time." I was searching for a title for the book, and it was like, wow, it went off in my head. That's it. But I didn't entitle it More Prairie Time. But then now I realize I've had so many people say, well, we want more Prairie Time. I want to experience more Prairie Time. And so I thought, well, that would be a good name for a blog. It might be a good name for a book too. I don't know. I don't want to write the same book twice, but there are so many new stories that I could tell that maybe that'll happen at some point. I don't know. I just sort of tested the waters with the blog to see how, and so far, almost 40 people in almost 40 countries have looked at my blog. So
nice.
That's been kind of.
That is fun. Well, I will obviously link the Nature Conservancy and the Native Prairie Association of Texas in the notes so people can easily find those. We will, of course, have a link to your book, Prairie Time, a Blackland Portrait, and to your blog, moreprairietime.org. Is there any other places or ways that people can learn about your work or get in touch?
I don't actually have a website. That's probably one of my number one complaints. I probably need to get a website at some point. People can always send me messages through my blog. They go there. I can give my email out if you want me to or not. I don't know what.
No, and that's how I got in touch with you.
Yeah.
Through your blog.
I got in touch with you through your blog.
Perfect.
Yeah.
We're actually revamping our website right now, Matt, too. So I understand sometimes.
Well, I don't even have one. I need one, and one of my daughters could really do one for me, so I need to get her to do it. So yeah, that's something I need to do.
If they're tech savvy enough to put a Coca-Cola background in your Zoom, so I'm pretty sure they can create a website.
My youngest daughter is pretty tech savvy. I'm the little plug for her there. She's pretty good.
Nice. Get her on it.
Hokey doke.
I need to do that.
I think we've come down to our final question, Matt, and we ask this of everyone who we get to visit with on our podcast. But what do you think is the most important thing that each individual can do to reverse global warming and climate change?
Well, I think an awareness of choices, and I really think supporting conservation, and maybe even, and this is going to sound silly, and this is not because of your earlier question, I've actually been thinking about this. I think that putting in little pocket prairies in your backyard would be helpful, in that it causes, we just had, what was it, Snowmageddon? The prairies are ready to go. That snow insulated. I actually packed my water meter box with prairie grass because I was afraid if we got down to -0, I went open my water meter box and it's, in air, and I took prairie grass and I stuffed it in there, and it helped prevent it from freezing. We didn't have any freeze. It's insulation for the soil. It's insulation for the microbes. Insulation. I think prairies, as well as you say, they may be good ways to sequester carbon. Planting plants, it is, I think, a very humble start. But yeah, I think it is. Yeah.
I am 100% there with you. And just creating those pockets, as you say, is such a great way that we can not only help reverse climate change, but also connect more with nature. And it's right there in your yard. And I think you called it a spiritual experience. And it's so true.
It is.
They do so many different things for us. And although seemingly humble beginnings, I think can have a huge impact and be very meaningful. So I love that answer, Matt. Thank you.
I know that I don't know
Thank you
what
very much.
I don't know what I would have done without my garden during COVID. It was such a
Oh yeah.
refuge for me.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
To get to watch the prairie plants. I have a few little prairie plants planted on the edge of the sidewalks and in little gardens. And to watch the plant grow, to watch it come up, to watch it begin to fruit or flower and then to fruit, it's really cool. It's really cool. It is a spiritual experience. Yeah.
Well, that is the perfect segue. Listeners, for those of y'all who are with us over on Patreon, we are going to spend some more time with the amazing Matt White and talk to him about how he is restoring prairie space at his home, and hear all his experiences and nuggets of wisdom, and just have more prairie time with him. So join us over there. And Matt, thank you so much again for your time. We really appreciate your expertise, and thanks for making prairies come alive in such a magical way for us. This was great.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it immensely.